On January 24, 1945, in Alsace, a German soldier suddenly collapsed into the snow. Then another dropped. Then three more. Within minutes, 50 Germans would be cut down, not by rifle fire, but by artillery shells that seemed almost uncanny in their precision, striking the exact spots where men were stepping. German officers understood immediately. Someone was watching them, directing every blast with perfect accuracy. But where was he? They searched the frozen landscape relentlessly. They even walked within 4 meters of a shallow ditch. A few passed so close they nearly stepped on it. Yet none noticed the 5'5", 120-pound man hidden inside with a field telephone. They missed him because he wasn't breathing like a soldier at all. He was breathing like a turkey hunter. How could a technique used to hide from birds with some of the sharpest vision in nature turn a quiet Kentucky farmer into the most lethal forward observer of the entire war? To understand how Garlin Murl Conner pulled off such an impossible feat, you have to understand where he was and what he was facing. By January 1945, the war in Europe was approaching its end. The Allies had liberated France, reached the German border, and were only a few kilometers from the Rhine River, the last meaningful natural barrier before entering the heartland of Nazi Germany. But there was a major obstacle. In the Alsace region, near the town of Colmar, the German army still held a fortified pocket of resistance, the Colmar Pocket, the final major German foothold on the western side of the Rhine. The Americans needed to eliminate it. If the Germans held that position, they could threaten the entire Allied advance with a devastating flank attack, and the Germans had no intention of giving it up quietly. On January 24, 1945, they launched a fierce counteroffensive. 600 infantrymen, 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks, the most feared armored vehicles of the war, and several tank destroyers surged forward. Their mission was direct: smash through the American lines, split the defending units, and slaughter the isolated battalion trapped behind them. Facing this assault was the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. These men were exhausted. Many had been fighting for months with no break. Their defensive line was stretched far too thin to stop a German force of that size. It was a David and Goliath scenario. And the environment itself was lethal. Temperatures were -10 degrees Celsius. The earth was frozen solid. Snow covered every surface. This wasn't ordinary cold. It was the kind that makes metal brittle, that freezes gun oil, that can kill a man in mere hours if he remains still for too long. For most soldiers, it was a nightmare. But for one man in the 3rd Division, the conditions felt strangely familiar. The cold, the snow, the frozen ground. It looked like the hills of Kentucky in winter, a place he had hunted in since childhood. And that man was Garlin Murl Conner. He was small, only 5'5" and 120 pounds, with a slight build that didn't match anyone's idea of a soldier. In a photo, you might assume he was something else entirely, because that's exactly what he was, a poor farm boy from rural Kentucky. Conner was born on June 2, 1919, in the remote community of Erin, Kentucky, a place so isolated most residents had never seen a city. His family lived in deep poverty during the Great Depression. With 5 children and almost no income, survival depended on what they could hunt. Garland learned to shoot before he could read. He hunted deer, rabbits, squirrels, and birds, but the most difficult target of all was the wild turkey. Anyone who has hunted wild turkeys understands how impossibly sharp their eyesight is. They can spot the slightest movement, the flick of an eyelid, the shift of a wrist from hundreds of meters away. If you move, they vanish. If you breathe incorrectly, they vanish. Blink too often, and they're gone. So how do you hunt them? You don't move at all. Conner's father taught him a method known as still hunting. You choose a spot, blend perfectly with the environment, then remain motionless for hours. Your breathing becomes controlled. Your body becomes completely still. You dissolve into the landscape. You cease to exist. Later military accounts described Conner as a man uncannily attuned to the forest. He could move without detection. He could fade into vegetation until he was invisible. He possessed an almost unnatural ability to lie motionless for long periods. He had another skill as well. In the thick Kentucky woods, getting lost is easy. Hunters secretly mark trees as they travel, tiny cuts, snapped branches, signs only they can recognize, to create a hidden trail they can retrace. It's a navigation system used in unfamiliar or hostile terrain. Conner had mastered this technique by the time he was a teenager. These were the abilities he gained while hunting food to keep his family alive during the Great Depression. And in 1941, at age 21, he volunteered for the United States Army. What followed was nearly unparalleled. Conner spent 28 straight months, almost 2.5 years, in frontline combat. Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, the invasion of Sicily, Salerno, the brutal fighting at Anzio, southern France, Alsace, 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious landings, 7 combat wounds. Through it all, he relied on the same skills he had learned in Kentucky. The Army taught him to fire a weapon, but his father had taught him to vanish. The Army taught him battlefield tactics, but the Kentucky woods had taught him how to move through hostile territory. The Army made him a soldier. The Great Depression had made him a survivor. And on January 24, 1945, every one of those skills would determine whether he lived or whether the entire Allied line collapsed. On the morning of January 24, 1945, Garlin Conner wasn't supposed to be anywhere near combat. He was recovering from a hip injury in a field hospital several kilometers behind the front. But when he heard the thunder of German artillery, he immediately understood what it meant. His battalion was under assault, and his men were in danger. Without hesitation, he slipped out of the hospital, took a jeep, and drove straight back to the battlefield, arriving at the very moment Major General Lloyd B. Ramsey was asking for a volunteer for a mission everyone believed would end in death. Someone had to reach a forward observation point directly under German shelling and direct American artillery fire. No one expected the volunteer to return. Everyone knew what taking that assignment meant. Conner raised his hand without delay. He collected only 3 items: a spool of telephone wire, a field phone, and a Thompson submachine gun. Private First Class Robert A. Dutil offered to join him, and together the 2 men sprinted into the chaos. Conner ran nearly 400 yards, about 365 meters, across open ground while German shells tore the earth apart around him. As he moved, he unrolled the telephone wire behind him. But he wasn't just laying a communications line. He was also creating a path back, the same way he had marked trees while hunting deer in the forests of Kentucky. In the smoke, debris, and confusion of battle, that wire became both his lifeline to American artillery and his way of orienting himself in hostile territory. He crossed 30 yards, around 27 meters, beyond the American front. He was now inside the German assault zone. There he located his observation point, a shallow irrigation ditch no more than 30 centimeters deep. Even lying flat, part of his body remained exposed. Dutil settled into a separate ditch nearby, and Conner hooked up the field phone. "Command, this is Conner. I'm in position, ready for targets." And then he began the work he knew better than anyone alive: observing and waiting. The German assault force advanced. 600 infantrymen pushing forward in organized waves, supported by Tiger tanks growling in front. Conner remained perfectly still, watching every movement. Quietly, he whispered coordinates into the phone. 300 meters northeast, infantry formation, fire. Moments later, 105mm shells smashed into the advancing troops. Then, 400 meters east, Mark 6 tank, fire. The next barrage tore apart another section of the attack. The Germans quickly realized an observer was directing the fire. They scanned the field with binoculars, fired machine guns into anything suspicious, and sent patrols prowling through the snow to find him. During the second hour, Dutil was wounded and crawled to a better protected position. Conner stayed put, alone. German troops were closing in.
They passed within 20 meters, then 10, then 5. Some accounts claim they approached so closely that Conner could have stretched out his hand and touched their boots, yet they never detected him. Why? Because Conner wasn't breathing like a combat soldier. He was breathing like a turkey hunter. Slow, steady, perfectly controlled, with not the slightest movement. He had spent countless hours in the Kentucky woods training himself to remain invisible to birds with extraordinary eyesight. Compared to a wild turkey, a German infantryman was easy to hide from. But now a new danger emerged. The enemy had moved so close that American artillery risked killing Conner if they continued firing. And that was when he made his decision. By hour 3, the Germans were less than 5 meters from where he lay. He could hear their breathing. He could hear their boots crushing the frozen snow. He could distinguish the voices of officers shouting commands. American command pleaded with him through the telephone. "Conner, fall back. You're too close. We can't fire without hitting you." He looked at the enemy advancing and at the American lines far behind him. He knew exactly what would happen if the Germans broke through. His battalion would be overwhelmed and wiped out. Hundreds would die. Then he spoke the words that would define his legacy. "Blanket my position. Cover my position." The other end of the line fell silent. "Conner, are you saying?" "Yes, on top of me. Fire on my position." The official record later summarized his action with the line, "Ordered friendly artillery to concentrate directly on his own position, having resolved to die if necessary to halt the enemy advance." He had accepted the possibility of death. After a brief hesitation, the artillery officer issued the command. "All batteries, concentrate fire on Conner's coordinates. Fire." The sound began before the explosions arrived. A rising whistle, a violent rush of air, and then everything detonated at once. 105mm shells and 81mm mortars slammed directly onto Conner's position. The ground convulsed. Fragments of steel carved the air apart. Shockwaves pummeled the earth so hard that they forced air from the lungs. And still Conner lay motionless in the 30-centimeter ditch while friendly artillery tried to obliterate everything around him. The Germans only a few meters away were caught in the inferno. Men were hurled into the air. Bodies vanished into clouds of soil and smoke. Screams dissolved into the constant thunder of detonations. The attack formation disintegrated. Officers tried to shout orders, but no one could hear them over the roar. Soldiers fled in every direction. Tanks pulled back blindly, their crews stunned by the debris and smoke. Then, as abruptly as the barrage had begun, it ceased. A suffocating silence followed. The American line waited, uncertain, strained. No one believed anyone could have survived the bombardment. The shells had fallen so close that even seasoned soldiers assumed Conner had been killed. And then the field phone crackled. "Command, this is Conner. Alive. Enemy retreating. Estimated casualties, at least 50 dead, over 100 wounded. Attack halted. Line secure." Garlin Conner had lived. He had ordered artillery fire on his own coordinates, survived a storm of shrapnel and explosives at point-blank range, and emerged untouched. Later that day, American patrols surveyed the battlefield. They counted 50 German dead and over 100 wounded.
They discovered abandoned rifles, scattered gear, helmets, maps, and a shallow irrigation ditch barely 30 centimeters deep. Inside it lay a field telephone and a Thompson submachine gun. The American soldiers stared at that ditch, then at the massive shell craters surrounding it, some no more than 5 meters away, and were unable to comprehend how a human being could have stayed alive in such a place. But Garlin Conner himself was not shocked. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of vanishing in the Kentucky woodlands, tracking turkeys, stalking deer, holding himself perfectly still while birds with the keenest eyesight on the continent passed within centimeters. For him, this was simply another hunt. The only difference was that this time his quarry wasn't a single animal, it was an entire army. But no true hero emerges untouched. That never happens. Conner didn't stop fighting after that day. 10 days later, on February 3, 1945, he led an assault in an urban environment. During that engagement, he personally killed 12 German soldiers and captured 75 prisoners. For this, he earned his 4th Silver Star. He fought on until March 1945, remaining on the front lines until the war in Europe finally ended. Across 28 months of non-stop combat, Conner was wounded 7 separate times. 7 times he spilled blood in foreign lands. 7 times he was sent to field hospitals, and 7 times he returned to the fight. By the end of the conflict, he held more decorations than almost any American soldier, second only to Audie Murphy. His record included the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 4 Silver Stars, 4 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, and the French Croix de Guerre. But decorations cannot repair the human mind. In the summer of 1945, Garlin Conner went back to Kentucky. The people of Clinton County organized a parade. They cheered. Children waved flags. Everyone hailed him as a hero. And then he went home and never spoke of the war again. Not to his wife Pauline, whom he married the following year. Not to fellow veterans. Not to his children. Not to anyone. He bought a 36-acre farm near Albany, Kentucky. He planted tobacco. He served 16 years as president of the County Farm Bureau. He lived quietly, simply. Yet at night he battled nightmares. He woke screaming. He escaped to the porch to smoke alone in the dark. His medals remained buried at the bottom of a duffel bag. He never displayed them, never talked about them, never even acknowledged them. It was undiagnosed PTSD, though in 1945 the condition had no name. You simply endured it. In 1998, at the age of 79, Garlin Murl Conner died from kidney failure and diabetes. He was laid to rest in Kentucky, a quiet farmer, a turkey hunter, a man whose extraordinary service had faded from public memory. Only his widow, Pauline, still carried the weight of his story. And she refused to let the world forget him. For 22 years, Pauline Wells Conner fought to secure her husband's rightful recognition. She gathered witness statements, dug up military documentation, contacted officials, wrote letters, pushed relentlessly. She refused to quit because she knew what he had done. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Wiegman, Conner's battalion commander, wrote, "There is no doubt that Lieutenant Conner should have received the Medal of Honor for his actions. One of the greatest regrets of my career is failing to secure that award for the finest soldier I ever commanded." The finest soldier he ever commanded. On June 26, 2018, 73 years after the battle in Alsace, President Donald Trump posthumously presented the Medal of Honor to Garlin Murl Conner. Pauline attended the ceremony. She was 96 years old. She held the medal in her hands and wept. But Conner's legacy extends far beyond a medal. On January 24, 1945, an entire American battalion was saved from destruction because a 5'5", 120-pound farmer from Kentucky knew how to become invisible. Hundreds of soldiers survived, men who later married, raised families, built lives, because Garlin Conner lay in a frozen ditch and ordered artillery fire onto his own position. The American line held. The German assault failed. The Colmar Pocket was ultimately destroyed. The Allies crossed the Rhine. Berlin fell. The war ended. And then Conner went home, purchased 36 acres, planted tobacco, and hunted game the same way he had as a child. Years later, someone finally asked him the secret of his survival, how he managed to do what he did. His answer was simple. My father taught me to be fearless when I hunted. Fearless doesn't mean you have no fear. It means you do what must be done despite the fear. And that is ultimately the story of Garlin Murl Conner, a poor farm boy shaped by the Great Depression, who learned to hunt turkeys to feed his family, who went to war and discovered that the same skills that hid him from animals could also hid him from entire armies. A man who used a roll of telephone wire as a trail marker, who remained completely motionless for 3 hours in freezing temperatures while enemy soldiers walked meters away, who ordered artillery fire upon himself because it was the only way to save his comrades, and who returned home to bury his medals at the bottom of a bag and never speak of it again. Because for Garlin Conner, the war was never about glory or recognition or decorations. It was about doing what was necessary, exactly as his father had taught him.